I'm Kat Oriel, a reporter with Forbes Breaking News. Today I'm here with Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining me today, Congressman.
Happy to be with you.
So today marks the 11th anniversary of the Sandy Hook mass shooting that took place in 2012. Can you walk me back to that painful day? Where were you and what were you doing when you found out, and what emotions were going through your head?
No, it's painful to remember, and it still feels fresh just because the tragedy was so horrendous. I remember exactly what I was doing. I was in a restaurant having a sandwich, and the restaurant happened to have a television monitor tuned into one of the cable news stations, and it was up, and it was clear, even with the early reports, that the tragedy had been huge. It was some time before we knew the scope of it, but obviously it caught my attention because while Sandy Hook Elementary School isn't precisely in my congressional district, it's about 2 miles north of the line. We're a small community, so everyone knows everybody in Fairfield County. And then, of course, the rest of the day was just story after story. As you might imagine, parents, it's a small town, Newtown, Connecticut, and parents descended onto the school, and you can only imagine the pain of those parents whose children were not initially known to be safe. And the governor, then Governor Dan Malloy, was there, and the parents were hysterical, and so it was just probably one of the worst days of my life in terms of understanding the tragedy that was occurring there. And then, of course, as fact after fact came out, Adam Lanza, this obviously deeply disturbed individual who had killed his mother and then gone on the rampage at this school, just the whole day was filled with increasingly appalling facts. And then, candidly, for years afterwards, until we actually finally just recently made some progress at the federal level, I had to meet with these parents, people like Mark Barden, whose son was killed. I had to meet with them year after year, just saying, nothing's moving in the U.S. Congress, and that was in many ways as bad as the initial day.
So how is the community doing 11 years later? I know we often see the parents of the victims coming together and showing support. So how do you feel like the community has been stronger in the past 11 years? Or do you feel like there is still some disappointment that there hasn't been much action on the federal level?
I think it's probably hard for somebody like me who's never been through the murder of a child to characterize how people get through that. I know that that's something, and I just know this from talking to the parents of Sandy Hook, it's not something that you ever recover from. My observation would be, and this is one of the things that I just stand in awe with respect to the parents, my observation would be that an awful lot of parents took this tragedy, this rage, this horror that is unimaginable to most of us, and used it as energy to become advocates. And very quickly a number of nonprofits were set up, both to care for the families of the victims, but also to try to make some progress against the obvious and glaring and unique problems that the United States has with gun violence. So just as we saw at Parkland and elsewhere, an awful lot of people have taken what I can only imagine is all-consuming rage and turned it into advocacy. And that was hard. It was really hard in the sense that, Connecticut, of course, where this took place, very quickly made some real progress that has tamped down gun violence in Connecticut around universal background checks and that sort of thing. But for years, the federal government response to the almost daily shootings was, yet another moment of silence in the House of Representatives. And after a couple of years of that, I got so enraged that I decided, damn it, I'm not doing any more moments of silence, because this body, Article I authority, arguably the most powerful body in the country, the Congress, was choosing to do absolutely nothing about, again, the unique American gun violence, even though many of the measures that we're trying to pass here enjoy vast majority support, things like background checks. So to really answer your question, somehow the parents of Sandy Hook turned unimaginable tragedy into advocacy and a commitment to try to make sure that others don't go through what they went through.
I did want to ask you about something you just touched on, the fact that you've mentioned taking your pain into advocacy, but you refuse to do so by taking a moment of silence. So can you talk to me more about the motivation behind this? Because after all these tragedies, we often see lawmakers from across the country or that particular area take moments of silence. But what is your rationale for being like, I'm not partaking in that?
Yeah, I mean, it caused a little bit of a stir at the time, and some people even accused me of being disrespectful. But I'd never felt so much conviction before in my life. Maybe because there's a lot of tragedy in the world, but that one really struck literally close to home. And to hear my colleagues say in the Congress of the United States, in a purported democracy where the majority gets its way, that their response to these daily or weekly killings is going to be this solemn moment on the floor where we bow our heads and are quiet for 20 seconds, something that I suppose makes us feel like we're doing something. Baloney, we're not doing a damn thing. And so it just increasingly, as some people say, thoughts and prayers are nice, but what we really need here is action. Your thoughts and prayers really don't stop the next attack. Thank you very much. So as you can tell, it still brings some rage in me. And again, some of this stuff is hard, right? Defining an assault weapon, that's not a simple thing, but some of this stuff is easy, right? And first of all, the easy thing is to acknowledge that the United States has a unique problem, right? The United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, Korea, no other industrialized country has this problem. And the idea that it's somehow video games or people not going to church, it's just insane. People are dying, tens of thousands of people are dying because we are a society awash in guns. And so that's annoying, that's aggravating. And then again, what's really galling is we supposedly live in a democracy, so you'd like to believe that something like universal background checks, the idea that we ought to check you out to make sure you're not a violent criminal before you can acquire a weapon, that enjoys 90% plus support, and yet it can't pass the legislature of the United States. That, you combine all that stuff and it's not hard to get enraged.
Well, last year there was a bill that passed, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which had support from senators from like Texas Republican John Cornyn. So what do you feel about that legislation? Do you feel like there has been some improvement on gun violence since that legislation has been passed, or is it still not doing enough?
Yeah, as I said, the horror of year after year after year of, sitting down with Mark Barden, who lost his son at Sandy Hook, and saying the Congress did absolutely nothing. When we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act about a year ago, for the first time in almost a generation, actually, we passed, I would call it weak. There's an awful lot more we need to do, but we actually passed some measures that will save lives. Enhanced background checks, which we think is already out there saving lives. Money available for schools as grants to better protect those schools. Money available for mental health care to try to identify and maybe stop some of those very angry people who often are involved in these killings. Frankly, we don't talk about it enough, but 2/3-ish of the gun deaths in this country are suicides. And, there's obviously a mental health care component to that. So that's all good. And so for the first time, we were able to say that on a bipartisan basis, we took some steps in the Congress that are keeping Americans alive. The reason, I don't overly celebrate that point is that we still have a huge problem and we still have a long way to go. And I mean, let me be clear. We have a long way to go consistent with Second Amendment rights. Things that we could do, things that don't get talked about. Again, those suicides, safe storage. We don't talk about it at all. But, if we just had standards for people who are entitled to keep and bear arms, in a way that makes sure that the teenage child doesn't stumble on them, to make sure that they don't get stolen and used in a crime, there's just so much more that we can do.
You've touched on a few countries that are doing a better job than the U.S. You mentioned that this is a very unique problem to the United States. So is there an example of a country or a place in the U.S. locally where you're like, this is a shining example of what we need to be doing on a federal level?
Yeah, it's hard to point to other countries. You can say that, look, Australia, after a brutal mass murder, basically outlawed long guns, assault weapons, certainly, and collected them all. A lot of that stuff doesn't work in the United States, where you do have a Second Amendment that I raise my right hand every 2 years to say I support. It's part of our Constitution. And so, the Second Amendment really takes off the table a lot of things that are done in other countries. And before you get to arguing about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we have so much that we can do within the confines of the Second Amendment that we haven't done, that you don't need to get into a long constitutional argument. Again, we've touched on some of these things. Universal background check. Nobody has ever alleged that that's inconsistent with the Second Amendment. Better safe storage standards. Nobody's ever said that that's inconsistent with the Second Amendment. So there's so much that we can do. And yes, we can use other countries as a model to a point, but to a point, because again, the United Kingdom, Germany, they don't have a guaranteed constitutional right to keep and bear arms.
Mm-hmm. And then in our final few minutes together, I do want to touch on more current events and news of the day. So do you feel like there's any chance that the supplemental could be passed before the end of the year?
The supplemental will not pass before the end of the year. We're down to about a day, maybe 24 hours of legislative time in the House. And so this will, if it happens in January. And I certainly hope that it does. Because the House in particular is so dysfunctional, the new speaker chose to approve Israel aid so long as the House agreed to dismantle one of President Biden's policy priorities, that is, providing the IRS the resources it needs to go after tax cheats. Now the story on the Republican Party is that we'll consider funding Ukraine against a murderous Russian onslaught, but the Democrats have to give us border policy change. Now, I'm not opposed to border policy change, and in fact, I would welcome it. But what you see happening now is the Republicans using both Israel aid and Ukraine aid as a hostage, essentially, to getting other stuff that they want. Now, again, I support negotiations for changes in border policy. We obviously have a real problem on our southern border, but nobody should be comfortable saying, hey, if I don't get everything I want, Ukraine gets it in the head. And sadly, we saw the voting in the House. About half the Republicans just don't care about Ukraine anymore. Even though, should Ukraine ultimately fall to Vladimir Putin, we will be dealing with Vladimir Putin going for more, and probably in a NATO country. And so, again, it's just exasperating. But no, to answer your question, it's not happening before the end of the year. Hopefully, in January, we can provide aid to Ukraine, to Israel, and some aid to Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was going to be my second question. If you feel like Biden should concede any of the border proposals that they have in order to get the aid for Ukraine and Israel passed, but are you saying that just because, it feels like a hostage situation where it's, what they want in order to get what the Democrats want, you feel like there's no room for Biden conceding, or maybe he should?
Well, think about the implications of saying, I'm only going to approve Ukraine aid if I get what I want on the border. A very real possible outcome, if that's your point of view, is that you get nothing on the border because you've demanded too much, and that's where we are right now, and Ukraine gets nothing. So now Putin is in Ukraine and thinking about Poland and thinking about Moldova, and you've gotten nothing on the border. I mean, is that not the definition of absolute stupidity? And yet, again, to be clear, by all means, let's negotiate on the border. It's very, very hard. The Congress hasn't passed border or immigration legislation in 3 decades. So to think that all of a sudden now we're going to get it done in a couple of weeks, and that is a gating item for Ukraine, that's just not the way to think about it. Again, we should pass something on the border, but why would you put yourself in the position of getting nothing on the border and leaving Ukraine prey to Vladimir Putin? That's just not worthy of the United States of America.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That's the end of my questions. Do you have anything else that you would like to add about, the Sandy Hook anniversary or current events of the day that we didn't get to touch on already?
No, I think we covered it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Okay. Thanks a lot.